Hello, everyone. I think we are live, and welcome to our Facebook Ask an Expert with Baptist Health. My name is Jean, and I'll be your host and moderator for today. I'm pretty excited about our topic. We're talking about stress. And I know it sounds a little funny to be excited about this topic, but I think each time I hear about it, hear something new about how to manage stress in our everyday lives. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Kal. He's our subject expert today. And so, Kal, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thanks, Jean. Hello, everyone. My name's Kal Kseib. I have a background in psychology, a master's and doctorate in health psychology in particular. So emotional and psychological well-being is really what I'm passionate about. And stress, of course, is something that is really showing up for most of us right now. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion.
Yeah, most certainly. So let's go ahead and get into it, Kal. I mean, it's so great to have you here. And for those of you who are tuning in, I really invite you throughout the time that we're talking today to drop a comment, say hello. We'll be monitoring those and addressing any questions that you may have. And I feel like, with this topic, it gets a lot of buzz with professionals, talking about stress, I think fairly often. Would you agree, Kal?
Yes, I mean it's a huge topic. So I just echo that, Jean, and please let's make this as interactive as possible. It'd be great to see your comments, and please do ask any questions that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Kal, I'd like to pose the question to you. So, why is stress so important to actually talk about?
Well, I think the number one thing to say about this is that, there's no one who's immune to stress. We all experience it. And that may seem like an obvious thing to say, but it's also this sense of it connects us all. So whether we think other people may have it figured out or not, there's always stress in our lives. And if you don't have stress, I'd like to check your pulse because there's always a level of stress there. I think what then becomes important is really starting to understand the nuance around stress. So first of all, just asking the question, what does stress mean for you? So the example that I use here is we often say if Jean, you met a friend and you wanted me to meet one of your friends, and I said, "Oh, what's your friend like?" And you said to me, "Well, he's really nice."
Mm-hmm.
It's something that we often say, but then in my mind, I'd be saying, "Well, what does nice actually mean? What's he actually like?" And we'd want to dig a little bit deeper, and that's a little bit like our stress. So with stress, we often say, "Oh, I'm stressed," but I always like to ask, well, what does stress mean to you? Where is it showing up in your body? What emotions are you feeling? Are you exhausted, or are you noticing a tension in your body, or something else? And or you're feeling lonely, perhaps, and really getting clear on what that is becomes important. So I use the idea of stress being like a code that we can start to figure out, and the beginning of that code is understanding what does that stress mean for you. What is it like for you? So that I think that's probably where I would start with stress, without going into all the reasons why stress is impactful on the body. That's where I'd like to start in terms of managing stress.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. And, I think you'll be mentioning kind of the different kinds of stress. Do you feel like that's a good place maybe to start to kind of differentiate? I think I've heard heard of this before, that not all stress is bad, right, Cal? I mean, in conversation, a lot of times we think of that word stress as it being bad, but it's not always the case.
Yes. So there's actually something cool. We don't have it here. I probably should have had it as a slide here, but the Yerkes-Dodson curve is something that's quite well known in talking about stress, and that's really looking at this curve that starts off with too little stress and then goes up to where we get to just the right amount of stress, and then comes down to where we've got too much stress in our lives. So too little, just the right amount of stress is known as eustress. Okay. It's actually short for euphoric stress. So it's the kind of stress where we feel engaged. So you and I were talking this morning briefly about like, oh, we're excited about today's session. A little bit nervous there, maybe some other feelings, some butterflies or some uncertainty. We want it to go really well. And so, there is stress there. There's an elevation of stress, but it's an acute form of stress. It's short. After this, we'll go and move on and do something else, and we'll find time to relax. That's a helpful form of stress, and we need that in our lives. Where we get too much stress, when we come down the other side of the curve, where it's, the next form of stress is a kind of periodic stress, or what we call episodic stress. That's the kind of stress where, it could be related, for example, to having financial problems or relationship conflict. So it's this ongoing drip stress that is less beneficial for us, and of course can impact on our energy levels, our motivation, our mental health, and our emotional health. So that starts to affect us a little bit more. Where we really start to run into trouble is when we have high level chronic stress. So chronic stress is when we've got stress happening in our lives for an extended period of time, and it tends to be a high level. So we experience small things as big things. We make a mountain out of a molehill, but not in our minds, in our bodies. So we experience something very almost can be even violently in our bodies in terms of high levels of anxiety. On a scale of 1 to 10, we're closer towards 8, 9, 10 for a lot of the time. And that is a really difficult place to be for people. And I think that more people are in that place than we care to think about or care to know. And it could be that some people who are here today with us, if they're not there right now, that they have been either during COVID or before COVID, and that is toxic on our bodies. That has a really big impact on our negative impact on our immune system and function. And that's not to terrify, because the other part of this is to recognize that when it comes to chronic stress, that map has often been laid, the foundation for that map around chronic stress is often laid early in life. So we can't talk about chronic stress without talking about trauma, and often trauma during our formative years. So when we experience traumatic experiences during our early years, that oftentimes, and that's not only trauma in a kind of abusive or violent sense, but it's also trauma in the sense of neglect. Trauma can come in many forms. So it can be it can be that kind of trauma too, where we didn't have enough attention or warmth or love or care. If that was the case, our map of how we deal with stress is formed very early on. So if we don't get that map created in ways that are helpful to us, it becomes really difficult to manage stress later in life. So again, this
Yeah.
to
And so, Cal, sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
but just a point here, just as you're talking about, chronic stress, and you touched a little bit about how it may kind of manifest, like physically for us. I know personally, when I am in that kind of bout of chronic stress, I tend to get, those tension headaches and, some aches in my shoulder and things like that, and a lot of tension. So, I mean, just to kind of talk a little bit more about, like, if we're not dealing with our stress in a positive, or, having those outlets for it. I mean, can you talk a little bit more about how it affects us, like our health overall?
Well, yeah, I mean, stress affects us in very different ways. And what stress tends to do is find a weak part of the body, and go straight,
My
take that
shoulders
part of
then.
take that part of take that part of the body to breakfast. So it really depends on many variables, but it tends to find weakness in the body, areas of fragility, and go for there. So that's how stress emanates for us. There's no consistency around that. It's really person to person. The next aspect to talk about is what happens next. When stress does show up, what happens next?
Yeah, and before you do kind of go into that, I
Yeah.
just want to take a pause here. We have a couple of comments. So looks like one from Jackie. So Jackie, it's good to hear from you. Definitely keep commenting. And then we have one from Jan as well. She said, my stress is fluid. Just as one stressful situation resolves, another one slaps me back. What do you kind of have to say, just sort of about her comment there?
Yeah, maybe Gene, this is a good time to pull up one of our slides. So,
Sure. Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
maybe the upstream, downstream. We'll start with that.
Sure. Let's go ahead and do it.
Okay, so thanks for the question, Jan. And so that's often the case in life. We rarely hear people say, well, I used to have problems when I was younger, but I don't have any anymore. I don't know. It's just, that's the way it happened. So one thing tends to resolve, the next thing comes. So there's a couple of things with this. One is we'll talk about this idea of reframing in a moment. That is to say, what if we were to reframe those problems as learning opportunity, or as a potential for growth, or that there's something in there that is important to learn, and that when we learn it, we'll move on to something else which will help us grow. Now that can often seem trite or undermining of sometimes very complex and painful situations. What I'm saying there in reframing isn't the answer. It's just a possibility. And it's just starting to think about, okay, if I'm under stress, not only in this situation, but in the next situation and the next situation, then how can I reframe that to make it work for me? How can I move that chronic stress into something that is more manageable in my day-to-day life? And with this idea here of upstream and downstream, it's just starting to think about, where does stress come from in our lives? So we often start to think about, okay, well, it's coming from the outside world. It's coming from, a work deadline, or a difficult boss, or a difficult personal situation. Our first question is, how do we close the door on certain aspects of stress? Where can we start to say no in our lives, where before we were saying yes? And where can we start to say yes in our lives, where before we were saying no? So this is the question of thinking about how stress comes into our lives, and saying, can we close the door on some areas of stress where I don't actually need to bring this stress into my life to begin with? That's not always possible, but just starting to think about that question, because humankind can only bear so much reality. We can only tolerate so much stress. So part of it is about closing the door on stress that's coming into our lives. That's upstream. Now, the downstream part is, how do I cultivate more effective ways of coping with stress or managing stress when it is in my life? So we can talk about some of those keys, Jean. I don't know if that would be helpful to talk about now.
Definitely, I believe so. And I know we have a couple of other images that you wanted to show for our viewers today, Kal. So just let me know, whenever you want to show them, they're appropriate. But yeah, I think, we talked, for our first few minutes here, just about what stress is, how it affects us negatively. But it's important to understand, how can we manage it in our everyday lives? Because I think that's so important. So it doesn't, kind of build up to a point where it's unmanageable, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does make sense. And let me ask you a question, Jean. When, when you have that stress show up and you feel that tension in your shoulders, how do you manage that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, I've definitely learned to understand, I guess, how stress manifests for myself. So again, that's a trigger or a point for me of knowing, okay, wait a second, I got to take a step back, maybe take something off my plate, go outside. One of my favorite outlets for stress is exercise and just being outdoors, really.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've when we talk about that code, there's the code to what created about relieving stress. And it sounds like you've got some tried and tested ways of doing that.
Yes. Most certainly. Yeah. And I want to just kind of pose that question out to our viewers, as well as Kal goes through some of his, tips and tricks and things like that. What are some ways that maybe you feel, what's that kind of, notice for you of, oh man, I'm really stressed out. I need to kind of have that release. And what are some ways that, that helps you cope with stress? So I guess we'll go ahead and get into that, Kal, if you want to, of just keys to managing that stress in each day.
Sure. So that's really about what we might call a restorative niche. So what is your niche in learning to in restoring, in coping with those downstream challenges that we're having in terms of tension in the body, maybe a busy mind? And there are obviously a multitude of ways to do that, and they're all the simple ways can be the most effective with that. Maybe now is an opportunity, Jean, to bring up the last slide in terms of opportunities to manage stress.
Yeah, most definitely. And when you showed me this, Kal, I got excited to really hear what you had to say. So yeah, go ahead and take us through this.
No pressure then, Jean. So, well, let's start with, this is really, we can map this onto upstream and downstream. So the threats are the upstream and the stress that is coming into our lives. And some of this is less avoidable than others, if you like, but they're still nonetheless important stress factors. So we'll start with those before we move on to how we might relieve or cope with stress. So some of those hidden threats, harboring truth. Now, that might seem like a strange one, but if we're doing too little in our lives, if we're having whispers in our head about things that we are passionate about or curious about, at least, or things that we want to say in a relationship or in a work situation or put ourselves forward for, and we're not doing that, then that is showing up as a major stress factor in our internal experience. Boredom is another one. Again, on that curve, you say there's too little stress, then the right amount of stress, and then too much stress. this first piece, which is too little stress, is also as important as the end of the curve, which is too much stress. We rarely talk about there being too little stress in our lives, and that can exist too. And that can also have an impact on our immune function, on our health, if we don't have enough stress in our life, or at least enough of the right stress, the right kind of challenge in our life. So we'll talk about that in terms of opportunities in a moment, but feeling controlled, so a lack of autonomy in our lives. If we're feeling squashed or stifled in our lives, that's a huge stress factor. Now, in time of COVID, of course, uncertainty is high on people's agendas. How do we become more certain? How do we create a vaccine that's going to work for us? Uncertainty can be a huge stress factor in our lives, as we've all experienced. Chronic people pleasing. If we're looking to the external world to validate our own feelings, if we're needing to be seen as someone that perhaps we're not, or putting on a mask for too long of the time, that's exhausting. And again, has a stressful, has a stress function on our experience. Social prejudice, of course, that's been the focus of attention this year in a big way. Social prejudice has a huge impact on stress. Lack of control, that's linked to autonomy, again, a sense of self-reliance and mastery on our own experience. Physical safety, stability, chronic pain. So if we're in pain, that's obviously stressful on our bodies. It's a really difficult cycle to be in chronic pain, because we're not really getting a break. So chronic pain is leading to stress, and stress is leading to more pain. So relieving pain is not simple at all. But just to note here that it is a major stress factor. And financial worries, we mentioned that before as well, that periodic stress that we have from having financial pressures. So that all seems like doom and gloom, and to a certain extent, it's really the reality for many of us. And so it's just putting it out there on the table. Is there any of these which we can close the door on, or at least help ourselves with, to minimize stress coming into our lives? Now, if Jean, if you're happy for us to move on to opportunities, then I'd love to do that.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think, we all understand, I think, fairly clearly kind of what those hidden threats are. So I'd really love to hear kind of those hidden opportunities, because as I was reviewing those lists, a few of them were I'd like to, I guess, for you to elaborate a little bit more on. So go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Jean. So hidden opportunities. So responsibility, obviously, if it's the right kind of responsibility in our lives, taking responsibility for, it could be in a number of areas of our lives, taking responsibility for our own health, for example, or for something at work or in a personal situation. That can be challenging, but it really starts to build up our sense of autonomy, and that's what we come on to next. Having a sense of mastery or developing skills, cultivating our creativity. These are all things that provide a buffer for us from stress, an emotional and psychological buffer. Working with internal dialogue, emotions. So any kind of mindfulness practice here becomes important. Starting to, as we mentioned before, stress happens within us. It happens inside of us. Now, there may be other things outside of us that trigger us, our stress, for example, the stress we experience. And we may even associate, blame on other people for certain things, and there may be justification in doing that, but ultimately the stress that we feel is within us. So partly working with our internal dialogues and emotions is recognizing that we can take, if we choose, we can start to take ownership for what those feelings and thoughts are in our own internal lives. That doesn't make it easy, but it does make it possible to then navigate through some of these challenges. Autonomy, again, really, this is probably the number one opportunity in terms of relieving stress. If you were to say to me today, Jean, okay, pick out one thing that is most helpful in relieving stress.
How do you know I was going to ask you that?
Because I don't know. I just have a knack for reading minds. No, so if you were to ask me that question, I would say the number one thing to relieve stress is gaining a sense of autonomy. And again, in a world where there's social prejudice, there's a lot of external stuff going on. Gaining a sense of autonomy is not easy, but it is possible if we choose. Now, how do we do that? Again, that's connected to starting to do the things that matter to us, doing the things that we find meaning in, doing the things that spark joy in our lives, doing some challenges. So in there is another opportunity, which may be a hidden opportunity, is around challenges. So the Finnish people from Finland have this ingrained in their culture. This word, I'm going to butcher it here, but I believe it's Zizu. Sizu, which is really this idea of having challenge in our lives, and those challenge can come in lots of different ways. It could be in a sort of if we're doing an athletic range, maybe doing a 5K for the first time or whatever it might be, that kind of physical challenge, but also taking on a challenge of something that stretches us in other aspects of our lives as well. That's also another big opportunity to relieve stress. So can I just come back to that slide one more time?
Yeah, no problem. And Kal, as we're going to that, if you don't mind, just a comment here of just when you're saying autonomy and finding those things that it's really finding something that helps ground you, kind of, and a sense of control. Is that more of what you're saying when you say that word, like autonomy?
Yeah. So it is about grounding. It's also about just cultivating a sense of. I think this word buffering is an important one, and just building up our emotional and psychological immunity. So it enables us to withstand the inevitable challenges that life throws us at. It allows us to gain perspective in situations which are difficult. It allows us to be creative in finding solutions in times which are difficult. All of these things are very hard to come by if we don't have a sense of autonomy. If we have this sense of learned helplessness, which is that, for want of a better example, kicking a dead dog is like not going to help us, because that's our experience. Our experience is that we just cannot do anything about our situation, and that's a really difficult place to be in. There's no creativity, there's no sense of strength, there's no sense of choice. But all of those things are possible in our lives. So just starting to cultivate a sense of autonomy, strength, grounding through challenges becomes really important.
Yeah, no, most definitely. That's a really great point. And I mean, I think it's really excellent to just see this, list of, hidden threats of maybe it helps our viewers realize just some areas that they maybe didn't know of for threats of sources of stress. And then areas of where, they can take that opportunity to really be able to find that stress relief, and then also that management of it as well. So those are some wonderful points, and I really enjoyed your key takeaway there. Of that autonomy and sense of choice, sense of grounding. I think that's really powerful, and knowing that, you are in control of kind of the direction that you go. So very, very good point there, Cal. So any other things you want to mention as far as for our viewers for stress management before we wrap up for today?
Yeah, well, just before that, are there any questions or any discussion points that anyone listening has for us right now? I'd really like to just hear from everyone, rather than the sound of just me talking.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're making some great points, but yes, I welcome our viewers to chime in with any questions that you have for our last, few minutes that we have here. So as we're, if our viewers want to chime in, anything as far as resources that you would recommend for anyone who's experiencing like a great amount of stress?
Yeah, okay, good question, Jean. And as you said before, you have your ways to manage stress. I'm sure our viewers have their ways to manage stress. In trying to relieve stress, again, I made the point of this sense of autonomy being important. Where do we start with autonomy when we feel we have none? If we don't feel as though we have any control in our lives, where do we start? Well, what is it that we have control over that no one else can take away from us? Is our breath. So let's start there. Can we find a way just to work with our breath? And working with our breath starts with becoming aware of our breath, just noticing each breath in, each breath out. And that might bring a sense of anxiety. It might bring a sense of tension, perhaps. It's not always calming. It can be, and hopefully is. But it's the act of noticing and bringing a sense of compassion to that breath, that sense of, okay, here I am breathing, bring my awareness to the breath. Is it really a great act of self-care in that moment, and building up from these small acts. That in itself is an act. That act of self-care is a path towards autonomy. Is starting to take ownership of our own internal experience. Starts with our breath, helps just downregulate any difficult emotions. We're working with our autonomic nervous system in ways that are helpful to our body. And so that's where I would start, with breath work. Obviously, things like mindfulness practice, and there are so many ways to practice mindfulness. That's something that is now in the mainstream. Just talking about emotions and feelings, without necessarily, often we talk about, oh gosh, we have to talk about feelings again. Are you kidding me?
It's hard to talk about feelings.
It's hard, but I'm really noticing this, this seismic shift in our culture around talking about and sharing experience, emotions, and which is really encouraging to see. I have to say, I'm really seeing that that movement of people starting to talk about their feelings a little bit more, and that can be really helpful in trying to resolve some of these issues. I'll actually, if I do have just a couple of minutes, I'd like to share an example of that, Jean.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's quite a well-cited example of coming through traumatic experiences where there's a comparison made between survivors of the Holocaust and people and veterans coming back from service in Vietnam. What they found in veterans coming back from service in Vietnam was, I mean, and we're still seeing it today, very sadly, tragically, high rates of suicide among veterans. And there was very much, that was very much the case in following Vietnam. And that was compared with survivors of the Holocaust, where there was very little, if any, reports of suicide. In fact, there was quite the opposite. There were people coming back, survivors of the course, went on to flourish in their lives. And the question was asked, well, what was the difference there? Two traumatic, really unbelievable scenarios that are going on. Why the difference? And a working theory behind that is that people coming back from the Holocaust, survivors of the Holocaust, would come together in their communities, in their houses. They'd sit around the table and they'd talk. And they talk about their experiences, they share their experiences and what they went through. And it was this kind of connecting experience that they had. Whereas compared that with Vietnam, and often for many people, they didn't even know the point of it, and they weren't celebrated coming back. They were ostracized. There were challenges within family dynamics, and there was no sense of community or support, or very little at least. And so that disconnection there, that lack of shared experience, really led to some of these really tragic outcomes that we've seen. So that's an example of really sharing your experience, talking about your experiences being key, whether that be with a professional or with a friend or even with a stranger. Just finding a way, meaningful interactions around talking about these things can be really helpful.
Yeah, and that's such a great point, because I think now, more than ever, we need that connectedness, and that's just a great way. I mean, I know for myself, I talk with family members and friends and things like that throughout my week, and that's just part of my daily routine, and it's just so helpful, to just have that empathy from someone else and just talk about what is bothering you. So that's such a great point and a great example that you had there, Kal. And
if I can just add to that, if we don't have anyone there that we can talk to, whether it's a professional, a friend, or a stranger, or a colleague, then a great place to start is journaling and just getting some of this stuff down on paper and making it as far as possible pen and paper rather than on the phone in some way. And again, just trying to notice the difference between, we do all need connection. I think social media gets an unfairly bad rap, but there is something to be said about meaningful connection. So that meaningful connection can be online. It can be via social media and just keeping in touch with people and contributing and sharing. It's obviously with COVID, that's even more important now. But it's the meaningful bit. That is to say, are we just watching and scrolling and then doom scrolling and then leaving? Or are we actually engaging? And that's the important bit with connection. It can be online via social media. It's not all bad there. But it's just doing it in meaningful ways. This affiliative sense of, okay, I'm contributing and I'm getting a lot from just seeing other people's experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just having that balance between the two and using it in those ways, most certainly. All right. So before we wrap up for today, we did have one question from Jan. So she asked, what if someone else's sense of autonomy increases her stress? What would you say on that?
Well, I think that's quite a difficult question to answer without getting a little bit more detail.
Okay.
to be quite honest, there's obviously some nuance there to that, which is important not to overlook. I would say, it's not really power or authority over someone else is not the same as autonomy. I think that's the key thing there. If we feel minimized by someone else, that's not someone else's autonomy, that's their authority. And what then becomes important, if we can't change or influence the other person and their behavior, or can't get out of that situation, is how do we work with our own sense of autonomy? Again, it may sound trite, but it really does start with working with what we can work with, which starts with the breath, starts with talking with those who we can speak with, starts with journaling, starts with mindfulness, starts with recognizing what our priorities are and committing to them. But there's no way around it. The price to work through some of these things is discomfort, and and it requires courage as well. And what I would say to that question is, there's something else here which is really important, which is when we're under a huge amount of stress, we have to go through it. Is a paradox. We have to go through it alone, in a sense. We have to figure out what, well, we have to soothe our own difficult emotions. We have to work with it ourselves. But the other part of the paradox is we can't do it alone. We have to find support. We have to find allies. We have to find people that can help us through. There's a paradox there of walking through that door alone, and also having others there to support us.
Yeah, great response to that, I think. And Jan, I hope Kal answered your question for you and just gave you, some food for thought. So, we're at 40 minutes here. I know a little bit over of, what we normally do for our expert talks, but I think it was such a great topic and a lot of great things that you did talk about today, Kal. So thank you so much for joining me today. A really quick mention just before we end, I'd like the viewers to know that there are services available to you within all of the healthy living centers that we have throughout Jacksonville in our with our partnership with the First Coast YMCA. There's wellness coaches, RN wellness coaches, other virtual classes such as this, free biometric screenings, and virtual coaching sessions. So visit the link in the post to access all of these great programs and to sign up for e-newsletter if you want to keep on top of what we have. So thank you everyone so much for joining in with us today. And Kal, thank you again for your time. And I just hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Jean. Thanks to everyone for being here.
All right. Bye.